I'm anxious to hear the next speaker, Dr. Adam Criblez. Dr. Criblez is a professor in the History and Anthropology Department at Southeast Missouri State University. Dr. Criblez received his Bachelor of Arts from Ohio Wesleyan University in 2001, his MA from Kent University in 2003, and his PhD from Purdue University in 2008. Prior to coming to SEMO, he taught American history at Tiffin University and Ohio State University Mansfield, and also served as the executive director of the Hancock Historical Museum in Findlay, Ohio. In 2012, he published his first book titled Parading Patriotism, exploring 19th century 4th of July celebrations, which he received several awards. And in 2016, he published his second title, Tall Tales and Short Shorts, detailing a professional basketball in the 1970s. Today, Dr. Criblez will be presenting history of early Cape Girardeau. Dr. Criblez?
I've gotten used to teaching with the mask on, but it's much easier to understand me, I'm sure, without having to wear that. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Usually pretty loud, so that's usually not an issue. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation to come and speak. One of the other occupations that I held at the university was the director of the Center for Regional History. SEMO is blessed to have a fantastic public history program, and part of that is the Center for Regional History. In the last couple months, we've transitioned to a new director, Dr. Stephen Hoffman, who many of you in the room might know for his work throughout the state with public history. But I'm still very interested in the history of the region. As you heard there, I am not from Southeast Missouri, and in fact have been here less than a decade. When I first applied for the job, I'm not sure if any of you know how robust the job market is for people with PhDs in history. It's not great. It's not great. And as I remind my students daily, I'm very fortunate to have the position teaching at Southeast. But one of the things that I found when I was applying to work here at Southeast was that I had no idea where Cape Girardeau was. And in fact, once I got the interview, I interviewed initially at the American Historical Association meeting. I believe it was in Chicago that year. And so the first time I was ever in Cape was for a job interview. And so I had to Google, where is Cape Girardeau? And I found that when I took the position, my boss at the time, Dr. Wayne Bowen, asked if I had an interest in running the Center for Regional History, which at the time was run by Dr. Frank Nickel, another very common name, and many of you I see shaking heads, you know Dr. Nickel. And so not only did I have to move to Southeast Missouri, but I also had to fill the shoes of a legend. And neither was an easy task, and neither has been an easy task. So I became the director of the Center for Regional History, knowing nothing about the region or the history of the region. Needless to say, I had to pretty quickly catch up. And in so doing, I found a lot of terribly interesting history. And the thing that I become most fascinated with, and with which much of my presentation is going to deal today, is the idea of a middle ground, of an area where many cultures have come together and collided to create a very unique culture and society. When I first moved to Cape, or when I first visited Cape, I came from a town in Ohio that was of a very similar size, about 40,000 people. It was an urban area surrounded by a bunch of farmland, which again is not unlike Cape Girardeau. And I felt very comfortable here. I moved here from Ohio, to Cape from Ohio. And so Cape felt, upon first blush, very Midwestern. Then I went to Cracker Barrel in Cape Girardeau. And when the lovely waitress said, "Honey, can I get you a refill on that coffee?" I realized that in fact, I was no longer, I wasn't in Kansas anymore. And so I found that that visit was kind of a microcosm of Cape Girardeau, and not only of modern Cape Girardeau, but of early Cape Girardeau. One thing I often ask when I teach or I give public talks in Cape is I ask the people there whether Cape is a Midwestern city or a Southern city. And I get hem-haws and a bunch of, well, it's a little bit of A and a little bit of B. And then I ask them, okay, so is St. Louis a Midwestern or a Southern city? And almost universally, Midwestern, right? Everybody says Midwestern. What about Memphis? Well, that's Southern. Well, what's the biggest city between Memphis and St. Louis? Well, Cape Girardeau. So is Cape Girardeau Midwestern or Southern? Well, I don't know. And again, depending on who you ask, for many of our students, Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, Cape is the biggest city that they've ever lived in. They're coming from the Boot Heel or other smaller towns. For those coming from St. Louis, Cape Girardeau is the smallest city they've ever lived in. And so it's a blending of cultures now, certainly. Yet Cape Girardeau has also been a middle ground, a blending of cultures since its inception. In the 18th and 19th century, Cape Girardeau was navigated by Africans, African Americans, by the French, the Spanish, English, and indigenous people. The indigenous people that lived there also weren't from there, if you want to use those terms. The indigenous people that lived and interacted with the French and the Spanish were from Ohio, much like me. But they were kicked out of Ohio, pushed west by Americans encroaching into their areas. And when Americans arrived, farther negotiations ensued. Southern Americans moving into the region from western Kentucky or western Tennessee to get beyond the reach of the expanding U.S. government came hoping to maintain their institution of slavery. Adding to the mix in the early and mid-19th century immigrants, many of whom were of German persuasion. They wanted to replicate their old world life, which by and large did not include slavery. And in fact, many of them were ardently opposed to slavery. So you have not only a blending of cultures, the French, the Spanish, African American, indigenous peoples, but also Southern Americans and Germans, Midwestern, Northern Americans, all kind of coming together and crashing together in places like Cape Girardeau. As I'll talk about in a little bit as well, Civil War Cape Girardeau was similarly divided, north and south, because of these cultures that had come to the Cape. Before I talk about specifics of early Cape Girardeau, I want to publicly thank Charlotte Slinkard, sitting right in the middle of the room here, without whom I would know very, very little about the first part of what I'm going to talk about today. Charlotte has been working diligently for a very long time on a book about the first settlers of Cape Girardeau, after whom the city is named, the Girardeau family. And so I'm like Dr. Person before me, I'm not going to steal the thunder of Charlotte's upcoming book, of which I've been fortunate to help edit and provide some feedback on. But I want to thank you again, Charlotte, for all the information. So when I moved to Cape Girardeau, I was told stories about how Cape was founded, how it was named, and these are stories that were passed down generation by generation. And it fittingly, my first book project about the 4th of July deals a lot with the idea of historical or collective memory, that we remember things as a society in ways that shape who we are and are shaped by the events that took place. So for example, when I looked at the 4th of July, Americans celebrating the 4th of July in the 19th century believed that they were celebrating much like their great-grandfathers had in the late 1700s. Turns out they were totally wrong, but they had this idea of how the 4th should be celebrated. And so when I came to Cape Girardeau, I was told a story about the founding of Cape that had been passed down for 100 years. Almost like the book of Numbers in the Bible, right? So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. That was how this story had been passed down. What we thought we knew was this. About 1735, so just before St. Genevieve, coincidentally, right? About 1735, a man named Girardeau, Girardot, established a trading post near a rock along the Mississippi River. Early 20th century historians, including Lewis Houck, who's kind of the father of Cape Girardeau in terms of its growth in the 19th century, wrote that a person with that name, just called Ensign Girardeau, stationed with the French at Kaskaskia on the east side of the river, moved across the river to trade with Indians. One historian wrote that Girardeau's trading post was, quote, the first business venture west of the Mississippi. We love to be the first blank west of the Mississippi around here, don't we? I've been involved with the Old McKendree Chapel, which is down near Jackson, Missouri, and their claim is oldest permanent Methodist church west of the Mississippi River, right? It's convenient that being just on the west bank makes everything the first west of the Mississippi River. Others wrote of Girardeau's trading post that the first Americans to cross the Mississippi River crossed at Cape Girardeau. Again, we like to inflate the importance of our own communities, don't we? So what we thought we knew was that in 1735, this Ensign Girardeau established a trading post on the west side of the river. Again, Charlotte has shown us that is bunk, that story is not true. In fact, the story, as is often the case, is far more interesting than even this fiction that has grown around it. So the individual, the Ensign Girardeau, after whom this tale was woven, is a man named Jean-Baptiste Girardeau. And Charlotte, I'm going to count on you to correct me. If I butcher names or if I get something incorrect, you're allowed to raise your hand or shake your head no. I give that right to my students, although most 18, 19, and 20-year-olds are a little too intimidated to do so. Jean-Baptiste Girardeau and his wife, Celeste Therese Nebeau, he was a French army officer. She was a French-Canadian woman. And they moved into the French territory and had two sons, both born in Illinois. The two sons, as the French like to confuse us, were named Pierre Girardeau and Jean-Pierre Girardeau. So we have Jean-Baptiste Girardeau's the dad, and then he has two sons, Pierre and Jean-Pierre, making Charlotte and every historian's job in the room that much more difficult because they all name each other after each other, and it becomes Girardeau the older, Girardeau the younger, and so on. So Jean-Baptiste Girardeau, the father, the patriarch, was a French officer, and so too did both sons become French military officers under King Louis XV. Both fought in the French and Indian Wars that took place in and around the region. All three men served near Kaskaskia at Fort de Chartres. Pierre became a judge, and Jean-Pierre, the eldest son, became a trader of pelts. He set up a shop on a cape jutting into the Mississippi River. When I moved to Cape Girardeau, I asked people, I was like, well, where's the cape? Because I know what a physical cape is, a rock that sticks into the water, right? And they're like, it's not, there's no cape, it's not there. I was like, well, why is it? Like, well, there used to be a cape there. Okay. So Jean-Pierre's trading post, set up near this cape, north of modern Cape Girardeau, was not included on French maps of the region, the last of which was completed around 1756. So we know, for example, that there was no trading post, there was no Girardeau there in 1756. But in 1765, after the conclusion of the French and Indian War, which transferred much power in the region to the English from the French, two British officers named Ross and Pittman were tasked with mapping the region. They had contact near Kaskaskia with Jean-Pierre Girardeau, and these men, in discussing the region with Jean-Pierre, included his trading center on their maps. Therefore, the trading center, to the best of our knowledge, was established sometime between the mid-1750s and the mid-1760s. It not having been on the maps of the French, but it being on the maps of the English. At that time, the trading center was visited not only by Native Americans in the region, but also by European trappers and European traders. Again, already becoming a center, a mixing, a blending of cultures. Early travelers to the region mentioned that there were huts and other small temporary shelters built to protect trade goods or to live for a short time. This was not permanent housing. These were not log structures or, of course, stone. The maps, which were published by Ross and Pittman, which were actually published in 1770 and 1772, show Girardeau's trading post, as well as nearby Native American villages, nearby European-built mines, quarries for rock and stone, as well as variations in elevation designated by hatch marks. Now, as was and is the case often in the 18th century, the names were spelled erratically. Although Jean-Baptiste Girardeau and his sons Jean-Pierre and Pierre spelled their name usually Girardeau, as we know, spelling was not necessarily standardized. Sometimes the ending instead of EAU was spelled OT, and in fact, on these English maps, that's how it was spelled. One of the map makers spelled it Cap instead of Cape, Girardeau with a T. The other Cap, Girardeau with neither EAU or T at the end, so it was Girardo. Sometimes it was spelled by people with a J, and oftentimes phonetically, if you see the word, you sound it out, oh, it's Girardeau, but the vast array of spellings persisted in the 1760s and 1770s. Just as we don't know exactly when Jean-Pierre Girardeau began his trading post, we don't actually know when it stopped for sure. We know that as late as 1782, he was still operating in Spanish territory, likely around Cape Girardeau, as it had become known, because it was a cape and the Girardeau family lived there. But this marks the last known record of Jean-Pierre. We know that he was still alive around 1782 because he was owed a debt of over 7,000 silver pieces by a man named Joseph Charleville, a once wealthy merchant who was in dire financial straits, and so when upon his death, his debts were explored and entered into record, and so we know that Jean-Pierre was owed that in 1782. That same summer, to make the link to begin to make links to Saint Genevieve, in 1782, the widow of Pierre Girardeau, Jean-Pierre's younger brother, Pierre being a magistrate in the region, his widow traveled to Saint Genevieve, where her son from an earlier marriage was taking a bride. Drawing up the marriage contract was Francois Belay. The Girardeau family is often given short shrift in stories of early Cape Girardeau, in large part because we didn't know much about him or the family. And in fact, what we thought we knew, as I said, was entirely wrong. And so I feel like I have to go back and apologize to all the Rotary groups and all the other groups I've talked to in my first 8 years here and say, yeah, I know that I told you 1735 and Jean-Baptiste, but I was wrong. And so typically, this is where the story of Cape Girardeau usually begins, with a man not named Girardeau, but a man named Lorimier, or because Americans have a hard time pronouncing words, Louis Lorimer. Although, of course, he was French, and so Louis Lorimier. I usually refer to him as Lorimer because that's what everybody around us does. But do know that I understand that the pronunciation, much like my last name, which was probably Criblez in France, but is Criblez, because, again, Americans don't pronounce words well. But Louis Lorimer. Louis Lorimer was born in 1748 near Montreal, which, of course, at the time was New France, it not yet having fallen to the English during the 7 Years' War. Like Jean-Pierre Girardeau, Louis and his 4 brothers and father were all in the French army. The family was also into fur trading. Again, the similarities between the Girardeaus and Lorimer is evident. In 1763, when Louis was just 15, the French lost to England in the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, or whatever you choose to refer that as. His father could no longer serve in the French army, and so they set up a trading post. From Canada, they moved into modern-day Ohio, which, again, ironic that they moved from Ohio to Cape Girardeau, mirroring much my own journey. In fact, some of the names, it's funny, I knew the names in Ohio history, and then came here and was like, oh, there's a connection. So the family moved into modern-day Ohio, and set up near a river, a creek, that became known as Loramie Creek, after the Lorimer family. By 1776, when Louis was 28 years old, Thomas Jefferson and others wrote the Declaration of Independence and declared the nation independent from England. The Ohio country, of course, was not one of the 13 colonies, but of course, during or after the American Revolution, it would become part of American territory, and during the Revolution, much fighting took place in and around the Ohio country. The Ohio country, likewise, was a middle ground. This is something I teach often with my students, the middle ground that was negotiated between the French and the English and the Americans and the Native people. And that Native Americans would often play the French off the English off the Americans, to try to improve their positions in trade or in negotiations for trade goods. And so the Ohio country was a physical middle ground, and that it was between the French strongholds in New France and Canada and the English in and around the 13 colonies. But in the Ohio country, it was also a figurative middle ground. The French and Indian Wars and the American Revolution all pitted European powers against one another, or Anglo powers against one another, but also Native Americans played a very important role in both wars. There was a lot of gray area, though, for non-English and non-American by the time of the American Revolution. And Louis Lorimer, again, in his late 20s, early 30s, as a Frenchman living in the Ohio country trading with Native Americans, had to navigate this carefully. By then, Louis was running his own trading post, buying furs from Native Americans and selling them. But the Americans didn't like the particular Indians he was trading with in Ohio. And so battles ensued as Americans fighting for their independence were angrily battling men like Louis Lorimer trading with the enemy. Among the men that he fought, that Lorimer himself and men alongside him fought, were George Rogers Clark and Daniel Boone, both of names who I heard growing up in Ohio and who you're likely familiar with as well. George Rogers Clark at the time was the highest ranking U.S. officer during the Revolution on the northwestern frontier. So he was not quite on the level of Washington, but he was just a half step down. In 1778, George Rogers Clark captured Kaskaskia, that's hard to say, captured Kaskaskia, which was formerly occupied by the French and the Girardeaus, while Daniel Boone was a pioneer settler whose daughter and two other girls were captured in Kentucky and taken north toward Ohio. Boone and his men daringly rescued the girls, and a fictionalized version of this became the basis for James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. 2 years later, though, in 1778, Boone himself was captured by a Shawnee leader named Blackfish, aided by men associated with Louis Lorimer. So Lorimer was among the group who captured Boone in 1778. An angry George Rogers Clark lashed out at Lorimer and burned his trading post and much of the surrounding kind of semi-temporary community to the ground. So Lorimer and George Rogers Clark hated each other, bitter enemies in Ohio. Yet after the Revolution, Lorimer realized that he probably shouldn't live in Ohio anymore, and so all I can think about is he gathered up his bags and he moved to Beverly. He's not the Beverly Hillbillies. In fact, he and his family moved downriver to St. Genevieve. They first stopped in St. Louis, stayed there for a while, and then crossed over to the west side of the river because it was still owned by the Spanish, and settled near St. Genevieve. Lorimer, by that point, knew several Indian languages, so he was a very valued member of society as an interpreter, but also, as was his occupation by this time, an Indian agent and fur trader. So he first lived near St. Genevieve for a time before moving south to an area which in the last 10 years or so had been abandoned by the Girardeaus. In 1793, Louis Lorimer moved his family south down near a place that was on the maps known as Cape Girardeau. His wife, Charlotte, was half Shawnee. He had very, very close ties with Indian women, as we just heard about, with the relationships going on between the French and the Indian. It was a much more fluid society, and Cape was certainly indicative of that. The Spanish government gave Lorimer 25,000 acres of land to settle, hoping that he could build a stable community on the west side of the river, and also to provide a buffer between Native Americans on the west and Spanish settlements, because the Spanish were far more interested in the east side of the state, just to the west of the river, and they hoped that Lorimer would bring some stability to the region. The Spanish also named Louis Lorimer a commandant of the Cape Girardeau district, one of 5 districts which divided southeast Missouri into sections. Lorimer, with his 25,000 acres of land, decided that he wanted to keep some, he wanted to sell some, and he wanted to give some away, hoping for favors. So he sold and gave away this land, and then he began this master plan to remove the name Cape Girardeau from the area. He decided that it was going to be named Lorimont. And everybody's, you can almost, sometimes in reading back in history, we see these moments, and you can just imagine like what people were thinking, even though they weren't necessarily writing it down. Because Louis Lorimer's like, we're going to call this place Lorimont. People are like, nope, it's Cape Girardeau. Are you sure? I think Lorimont's a great name. Cape Girardeau. And you can just kind of read into what people are writing. And in fact, I have to laugh. There's a company or two in town that are, I think it's maybe a real estate thing, whatever, but it's Lorimont. And I just laugh every time I see their little signs. I'm like, oh yeah, he finally got his wish, 200 years later. So Louis Lorimer tried to get this village renamed Lorimont, but by then it had been about 25 or 30 years, and so everybody had just started calling it Cape Girardeau, or more often just the Cape. Among the land that he gave away was some to a man named George Frederick Bollinger, who built a mill called Bollinger's Mill, and after whom Bollinger County is named. And Lorimer did decide to keep some choice land, and in fact, the land he kept was down by the river. Cape Girardeau is an interesting place geographically in that it is a flat, accessible river location, and it's really the only one, it's the best of them between Cairo to the south and St. Louis to the north. And so settling the downtown, what's now downtown Cape Girardeau, starts with not Girardeau, but with Louis Lorimer. On the land down near the river, Lorimer built a military post. He built a building that became known as the Red House. And this Red House would be a commercial, military, political, judicial, religious, and social center. It was literally the one building in town, so it did everything. There were religious ceremonies held there. There were legal cases decided there. It was a place everybody hung out. They bought supplies there. And this, again, is a blending of cultures. You could go in and hear various indigenous Native American languages spoken, and Lorimer was fluent in many. There were people, of course, speaking French and Spanish. You might even hear some English in there, but it was a blending of cultures from its earliest days. This was south of the original Cape, and the original Cape actually lasted until the 19th century when the physical Cape was destroyed to better allow for railroad access. So we only have a few paintings and I believe one photograph maybe of the Cape. In 1801, this land would change again dramatically when the Louisiana Territory was transferred from the Spanish to the French, and in 1803, of course, purchased by Thomas Jefferson from the French. Most of the Louisiana Purchase was unsettled and unexplored. I liken the American Louisiana Purchase to buying something on eBay that doesn't have a picture. You're just kind of hoping that the description is what it says it is, but then sometimes it arrives and it's maybe not exactly what you thought it was. That's much of what the Louisiana Purchase was for the Americans in 1803. Thomas Jefferson, of course, sent Meriwether Lewis, his private secretary, and William Clark to travel from Pittsburgh and ultimately to the Pacific Ocean. 11 men disembarked Pittsburgh in August of 1803. By the time they entered the Louisiana Territory, that had grown to 33. They stayed on the east side of the river until the transfer was complete, but when they came west, they would come to the Cape. This was not, however, William Clark's first trip through the region. In 1795, William Clark had been through as an agent of the United States to argue against the Spanish building a fort on the eastern shore of the river near New Madrid. So when he and Lewis returned in 1803, he was familiar with travel on the river. Cape Girardeau had about 1,000 residents when Lewis and Clark came to the Cape, and was important enough for the expedition to stop and recuperate before moving upstream on the Mississippi. Fittingly, Lewis Lorimer was at a horse race when Lewis and Clark arrived, and so he had to be called from there in order to greet these very important guests. Luckily, Meriwether Lewis kept copious notes, and his journals are fascinating, an exploration of not only the flora and fauna, the travel. If you've not read the journals of Lewis, they're fascinating. But Lewis takes time in his journal to describe Cape Girardeau. Of Lewis Lorimer, he says that Lorimer is about 5'8", with dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair pulled in a ponytail behind his head that went all the way down to the back of his knees. It was a very impressive, he cut an impressive figure, to say the least. In fact, in Cape Girardeau, there's a river wall, and if you go down to Cape at some point, one of the places you have to go is the river wall, where there are these various murals painted of moments in the history of Cape Girardeau. And there's one with Lewis Lorimer, and his back's turned, and inevitably my students or the kids, the tour, are like, who's the Indian guy up there? Well, that's Lewis Lorimer, because he's darkly skinned, darkly complected, his hair is very long, he had a wife who was half Shawnee. He was very much living in many cultures at once. So Lewis describes Lorimer, and Lewis doesn't have a lot of positive things, though, to say about the residents of Cape at that time. He calls them an unruly lot, like the uncivilized backwoodsmen of Kentucky and Tennessee, which is fitting because that's exactly what they were, many of whom had moved directly from Kentucky or Tennessee. Lewis also wrote about Lewis Lorimer's daughter. He called her remarkably handsome, the most decent-looking female I have seen since I left Louisville. I can only imagine that's a compliment, but interestingly, and this is one of these things that my predecessor, Dr. Nickel, always says, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So, according to local tradition and gossip, and fitting after your presentation, Lewis Lorimer's daughter gave birth to a child out of wedlock less than a year after Lewis and Clark visited, and Meriwether Lewis called her remarkably handsome. So, sometimes I have to explain that to my college students, and they're like, oh, you guys clearly caught on. So Meriwether Lewis goes to the Red House, maybe woos Lorimer's daughter, writes about how Lorimer is the head of this unruly backwoodsman country lot, but William Clark refused to go and visit Lorimer. He stayed at the actual Cape on the river, which is, maybe a mile north of the modern downtown. You see, William Clark was the brother of George Rogers Clark, the George Rogers Clark who had burned Lorimer's trading post in Ohio and whom had tried to kill one another on multiple occasions. Needless to say, William Clark was not interested in hanging out with Lorimer, no matter how attractive his daughter might have been. In fact, Lewis and Clark then stayed in Cape but a short time, and they left on their expedition to the west. So smitten were some of the people on that voyage that at least two came back and actually settled in southeast Missouri upon returning from the Pacific. Unfortunately, they moved near New Madrid about 1808, 1809, so they didn't stay long. By 1811, of course, there are the beginnings of rumblings in the earth, and by 1812, terrible earthquakes, and so they moved. They didn't stay long. But after Lewis and Clark left, Lorimer continued to expand his holdings. They traded furs at the Red House. Lorimer owned farmland around Cape, raising livestock. He had 2 mills and operated a ferry service across the Mississippi. The first bridge was not built across the Mississippi River at Cape Girardeau until 1927, so a ferry operated down there for many years. In 1805, Lorimer gave 4 acres of land on which to build a courthouse. receiving a license for a ferry boat across the river that year as well, and petitioned for the government to build a road connecting from St. Genevieve to Cape Girardeau to meet up with the new Madrid Road. The idea would be that they would complete what the Spanish had started, El Camino Real, the King's Highway, which is still the name of the road in Cape. The El Camino Real would be kind of completed here by Lorimer in 1805. In 1806, the village of Cape Girardeau was chartered, surveyed, and laid out. And in 1808, Cape Girardeau was incorporated as a town. Lorimer began selling downtown lots, and residents slowly started trickling in. Again, there were about 1,200 people that lived in Cape Girardeau, but Lorimer was interested in building a more robust downtown community. Of course, all the early houses faced the river because not only the view, but also because the river was the most important transportation hub in the region and would be for many, many years. Louis Lorimer also was a widower that year. His wife died, leaving him with 4 children to raise on his own. He was 60 years old at this point. And 4 years later, he too would die in 1812, the same year that America went to war against England. His red house lasted until 1850, when a tornado struck it and destroyed the structure. It was rebuilt in 2003 and still serves as a museum today. You can go and see the red house. It's located slightly closer to the river than the original red house. The original red house, there's a marker basically across the road from the Red House Museum indicating where Lorimer's original trading post was. The territory of Missouri was created in 1812, and the people started to establish a territorial government. William Clark was the first territorial governor and would once again wreak havoc on Louis Lorimer. In 1813, Governor Clark created a new court of common pleas. Louis Lorimer had donated land for that purpose and was totally still trying to call it Lormont, but he was still, he was adamant that Cape Girardeau should be the county seat. There were problems, however, with Lorimer's will, which made the title to his land suspect. Plus, we know their history. So instead of locating the county seat in Cape Girardeau, which was by far the largest village town in the region, it was located to a small place called Jackson, a few miles to the north. And so the county seat becomes Jackson, Missouri, although Cape Girardeau is, of course, the largest town of consequence, starting a rivalry that continues to this day. In fact, last night was the Cape-Jackson football game. Jackson only beat Cape by like 7 touchdowns, so Cape kept it pretty close, all things considered. My daughters were at the game, and I'm texting them like, how's the game going? They're like, not too bad. I was like, really, what's the score? 35-0. I was like, that's not good. But Cape and Jackson is a huge rivalry to this day, and my students, when I talk to high school students especially, they're always fascinated to know the history, that it traces back to Lewis and Clark, and the fact that William Clark, his brother, tried to kill Louis Lorimer, who was the founder of Cape Girardeau, and that Meriwether Lewis was hitting on his daughter. Like, it's this very salacious moment in the history of early Cape. Cape Girardeau grew slowly between the early 1800s and the 1830s. The decision to move the county seat to Jackson had a negative effect, as much business then moved north to be near the county seat. Inevitably, Cape, though, had enough issues with river traffic that a court of common pleas was necessitated. When riverboat traffic begins picking up in the 1830s, we start to see the beginning of prosperity in Cape. In 1836, Cape published its first newspaper. The first police department was established in the 1850s. Steamships coming up and down the river. Beginning in 1858, there were regular steamships between Cape and St. Louis, which, to the astonishment of my students now, it took 22 hours to go upstream from Cape to St. Louis and 12 hours to go downstream. And they complain about the 2 hours it takes to drive up to St. Louis or back. Twice a week, the Rudolph, the name of the steamship, steamed down to Cape and then returned back to St. Louis, which was remarkable for people at the time, that you could be in St. Louis the same day you left Cape. was remarkable. Prior to that, horse-drawn stagecoaches were the only way to get from point A to point B. Passengers in Cape could go to Pilot Knob, a 73-mile, 40-hour trip via stagecoach. From Pilot Knob, it was still another 8 to 10 hours to St. Louis. So this 50-hour journey from from Cape to St. Louis by stagecoach makes 22 hours on a steamship seem pretty reasonable. When the Civil War broke out, Cape again demonstrates its center of being divided. About 12% of Cape's population was made of slaves at the time, and Cape's population was split. Some sided with the Union, others with the Confederacy. Cape was occupied by the Union for much of the war, but church congregations likewise split. I mentioned that I work with Old McHenry Chapel in between Cape and Jackson. That congregation split. Old McHenry remained Union supported, and New McHenry, located in Jackson, was supported by Confederate sympathizers. Yet Cape, during the Civil War, occupied a key strategic location along the Mississippi River and a place called Crowley's Ridge. It was the first high ground on the Mississippi above Cairo, the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio. It was along a military road, and when Ulysses S. Grant came in 1861 to assume command of the district, he was happy to see that forts were being constructed. 4 forts were constructed in Cape Girardeau. They got really fancy with the naming. Forts A, B, C, and D. A and D to cover the river, B and C nearby roads. There was a battle in Cape Girardeau, rather forgettable in terms of military history, but demonstrates the divided nature of the city. Fighting slowed the commercial growth of Cape for much of the century. And by the late 19th century, Cape was not significantly larger than it had been 50 or 60 years earlier. Yet during this era, Cape shows again itself as a middle ground. There was a growing German Midwestern influence coming into Cape, as well as an African American influence as free people of color moved to Cape from regions to the south and east. And in 1873, the 3rd District Normal School was built in Cape Girardeau over vociferous opposition from places like Jackson, who believed that the school should be located there rather than in Cape. Years later, of course, that would become Southeast Missouri State University, bringing the whole thing in full circle. Do you have any questions? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned an incorporation before 1808. Who was that by?
The village?
Yeah.
The town? That would have been, what do you mean, who was it by?
Well, in 1808 is when the legislature started
Organizing
towns.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's always said that St. Genevieve was first. But you know what month?
I don't, I just have 1808. And this was a more recent source, so I would guess it's at least semi-reliable. But it could be as well that that was just what was passed down as the date. I don't have the source on that or the month. I just have 1808.
When you see on some of those state of Missouri websites, it says July 1808 for St. Genevieve, it's really August.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a date on that. So St. Gen was the first town incorporated.
So.
Yeah. Well, we believe so, of course, right. Well, I'm sure that Cape was like in June, or if I had to guess, I would say June, July, maybe. But no, I don't have a month on that. Yeah.
I have a question. There's a old French house across from the casino, and could you tell just a little bit of the history of that house? Like, when was it built? Who built it?
I don't know anything about that. I was gonna say, don't Chuck.
The Reynolds house, and that was moved there. That's not its original location, and I don't really know why.
That's not the original?
Well, it's not the original location of the house.
It's the original house, but they picked it up on trucks and moved it down the street.
And I don't know what'll happen there. It's a financial problem. It's a beautiful
Okay, so
house.
it hasn't been restored?
Yes,
Well, sort of.
It has
not
been.
recently.
it's been restored. It even has a basement, and it's now air conditioned. It's restoration.
But it does have the French front, big wide round porch.
Yes, sir.
Were there ever any Spanish soldiers station in Cape Girardeau?
Not to my knowledge, no. No, not until, I mean, yeah. Yes.
Was Lorgnier, was he involved in the British counterattack against St. Louis and Cahokia in 1780?
I don't think so. No, so 1780, he would have still been in Ohio. I don't know that he actually left. I don't think he went as far south as St. Louis. My understanding was that he just stayed in Ohio during the war. Yes?
You mentioned that he left St. Genevieve to go south in 1793. Do you know how long he lived in St. Genevieve?
No, because he left Ohio in, I want to say, after the war, 88 maybe. So as many as he was in St. Louis and then St. Genevieve. I haven't seen. I didn't look into it.
He's either in the 1787 census or
Yeah.
the
He's on the 1787 census,
Okay.
and in Spanish official correspondence, it's mentioned that he is coming to St. Genevieve.
Okay, in 87 you said?
1787.
Okay. Yeah, so I knew he left Ohio 85, 86, so he wasn't in St. Louis that long then, so okay. Any other questions? All right. Thanks again.
I think that what's always interesting is we hear these talks about not just specifically St. Genevieve, but other areas around us, how much interaction there's been over the years. And I hope in future conferences we can hear more about Cahokia and Deschartres and places like that were very important. And even that little town called St. Louis. Which was not the first town in Missouri. So we're going to take a little break here. We'll announce when we're ready to go back. There's still goodies in the back of the room. Bathrooms are outside, down the hallway and to the left. Thank you.